We were chatting the other day, and in our group about our stocks group basically, and the way to organize society came up, and Matt had an idea, and I'll tell you about that right now. So as a Marxist, I have a very small pea brain. I say socialism good, capitalism bad. On the other hand, you have capitalists who say, nah, socialism bad. They argue capitalism good. Also, very small brain. So, how do we solve this historical dilemma with all these puny brains? Enter Matt. Equipped with a very big brain and 9,000 IQs, Matt has come up with the following solution. Quote, no one really wants total socialism or pure capitalism. You kind of have to blend them. See the benefits of free markets or free healthcare. So I thought that we would start it off on that note. So Matt, you want to explain your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, the quote you used to describe me as what was it? Enlightened centrist,
Yes.
which of course there's many memes about left-leaning memes of making fun of people who basically don't take an opinion. But I think to give it some more nuance, I would say that I find generally positions in left and right politics to oftentimes be presented in their most extreme form. And, someone will say something like, we need free markets only, or deregulate everything, taxation is theft coming from the right, or socialism, get rid of all debt, or I'm not actually well equipped to talk about the other side of it because I actually tend to agree with. I generally think I am a left-leaning fellow, but when it comes to debating people who have stronger opinions, I find myself falling more towards the center. But I'm sure we're going to discuss about that in detail here.
Okay. Yeah. So you were saying okay. It looks like the video is not working now, which is perfect. The audio seems to be working though. So all right. So you were saying a mix of both seems like like the best system for you. Now, so name maybe some
Well, I mean, I
social.
think it's probably easier for us to start on common ground. I mean, we were debating another colleague of ours, someone we were both friends with and went to school with, and I actually find myself agreeing probably more towards you when it comes to the points he was bringing up, about the benefits of, for example, private healthcare or deregulation or lower taxes being better. The points you were making, I actually sympathized with more than his generally, and I'd
Right.
love to go back to some of those to find some common ground first.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what were we arguing about? How did that even start? Well, first it started because um, now I'm blanking on the name.
Bill Gates, was it? Or
No. It was our
it was
mutual
almost
friend
Bill
was
Gates.
saying something about how like there's a culture of poverty or something, or like and that was keeping people the way they were, or something along those lines. Um,
I'm
and then
going
I don't
back
know.
through it myself right now to find it.
Yeah, I don't know how our argument evolved from there. Okay.
Mm.
There we go. Now the video's back. This must be riveting viewing.
Stream just getting warmed up. Inclination to poverty.
Yeah. Inclination to poverty. That triggered me as a socialist, but that's not even really the most important.
Could you explain that point to me? Because I don't think I heard that part of it.
Well, I mean, it's he. He may have been. I don't want to put words in his mouth because he may have been saying something different than what I was saying. Like, How did the conversation go from there?
Well, the point I was generally making was, for example, if I'm going back through it, I can read a little bit about, for example, one point that stuck with me was Junyan's defense of privatized healthcare,
Oh, right.
and how
Yeah,
like
right. Because it worked better. It worked good for
for
him.
80% of Americans. Yeah, and one thing I'd like to exactly, it worked good for him, and therefore it's good. And more less anecdotally, his stat about 80% of Americans having more or less good healthcare seemed to be accurate based on some quick googling. But one thing that I would like to point out, and this is something that I actually did a little bit of googling in advance, is something that works doesn't necessarily mean something is the best. And there's lots of things to take away. Like no one wants socialized or unsocialized healthcare. They might think they do, but they don't. For example, like
Rich
the
people do.
great example for this is the ice cream vendor problem. Have you ever heard of this in economics, where you've got two ice cream vendors on a beach? If they spread out equally, they'll both cover the beach equally and share profits the best. That's the optimal position. But what ends up happening due to game theory is uh, the ice cream vendors both move towards the center of the beach, trying to cannibalize the other's sales while still keeping their half of the beach. And what you'll find is that both vendors tend towards the center until they're both in the center, not serving the edges of the beach well. So you have two ice cream vendors right next to each other, competing for half the beach, not serving the economic situation optimally. Now, that's a great example to me as to why like a privatized everything doesn't always work. You're not always left with the optimal situation. So if you imagine an ice cream vendor situation for healthcare, you end up dealing with healthcare providers who want to serve the most amount of people for the least amount of cost, not caring about the dredges of society and the fringes. And it might seem like it's working for that 80% group that might be referenced in that statistic. But you're just because it's economically or game theory optimized doesn't mean it's optimized for a social service, or something that should be a social service.
Okay, so what, like let's say all social services in the United States or some country were privatized. Other than it being shitty for poor people, like what are some consequences? Like what is the reason that's bad?
Well, economic waste for starters. I mean, you have to deal with marketing and the business functions for something that might not need it if it was socialized. It's really difficult to. Uh, One problem with capitalism is that because it's always striving for profit at the least cost, is that it's not necessarily you're now going to deal with an ethical situation where people with more money just live more than people that don't. And
True.
if you're creating a situation where the lack of money can kill you, well, that's something society strives to avoid. Now, there's plenty of capitalist arguments for that, but I mean, I'm just trying to simplify it for the sake of the conversation.
Sure. Okay. And so then, all right. So you've explained the problem with social services like healthcare, education. I'm assuming throw in that probably lots of other things. So what would you say is the closest to your ideal society that you can think of? Like, is there an example today?
I mean, something that I think works well in theory better than in practice, but something that I definitely love the idea of is public bids with private contractors. So, think like a road building enterprise. We have a functioning road highway system in the United States and Canada. I think
It doesn't function in
the
Canada?
interstate, yeah, I think it functions well, is what I'm saying. Relatively, I mean, you can drive to where you need to without paying tolls in most places. And I would argue the way that's accomplished with public bids that are fulfilled by private companies is a good example of the blend that I'm talking about, where a private enterprise and often ends up doing the work, saving costs the way they best see fit, but public works are still accomplished with public money.
Okay, so public-private partnerships, basically P3s.
Yeah, I mean, that's not really what I would say a good, clear example. Asking me for my ideal situation is, I mean, I don't believe in an ideal situation, first of all. I don't think you can have one
Right, but
because
what's the best example? Like, are
that's a
there?
great example of one, I would say. I also think that single payer healthcare is a great example of a pure socialist enterprise that's successful. And I'd say, as far as a private enterprise, I mean, the banking system is probably a failure, but the fact is, our international banking system works fairly consistently, and those are mostly private companies.
Okay, who's benefiting from that banking system though? That's working.
I
Working.
mean, if you're trying to, I don't want to say something and expose myself to a gotcha, but I find that
Is
in the
it working
private
for like the
sector,
bottom? Is it working for the bottom 60% of the global population?
I mean, I wouldn't say that the international banking system does. Obviously, no.
Okay, then we I think
But
we're
I
in
might
agreement. We're in
flip it
agreement.
back on your head though, and ask you in reverse: what's your ideal situation? What I in the situation I described?
What situation you described?
What's your ideal? I mean, obviously you're a socialist, but how would you modify capitalism? Would you fully turn it on its head, or would you, or do you think there's light changes to be done? I'm not quite sure what your stance is,
Yeah,
and
my
I'm
position
giving you
that
my position.
my position is that things like P3s, public-private partnerships, strong social safety net, strong government benefits, strong welfare state, all that stuff is nice, and we're not against it, but it doesn't solve the contradictions of capitalism, and it keeps the class system in the way it is, and um, it's also doomed to go roll back on itself, which
Okay,
is yeah.
this is a great point then for me to give you my stance on. I believe the solution to the problem you just outlined is something like the ebb and flow of what you might call centrism, but I would just call policies that evolve over time. And you have one year you have Roosevelt's New Deal, and the next year you'll have Reagan. Next generation you'll have Reagan, and these things ebb and flow to correct. Now, I also think capitalism is broken right now, and we're overdue for something like a New Deal to do a correction. But I wouldn't say that the solution is a pure socialism, and that's probably the best representation of my position based on what we were talking about.
So the New Deal is an interesting historical example because it's really like those 20 to 30 years really are the golden age of capitalism, but for I mean, you'd call it a global minority of people that got to take advantage of it. But you have to, I think you have to look at how those 20 to 30 years were possible in the first place. Um, just having let's say that the United States just having a bunch of new policies that were pro worker or not even pro worker but like more long term thinking for the capitalist class. In that they raise taxes, they raise the floor on workers. All kinds of new programs were created, and in fact, a lot of them took another 20 years to really get going under LBJ. But the reason that was all possible was because American capital was in a unique situation after the Second World War, where finally, after two world wars, enough capital had been destroyed to basically restart the whole system. Basically, you had a year zero situation where the United States was virtually untouched. Industry was booming because of the war, especially, and therefore they could. Now they had Europe. They had all these places around the world. These colonies that were now abandoned by France and Britain that they could export their capital to,
Yep.
and that's not a situation.
If I were to simplify what you're describing, I would argue that like wealth, basically, the wealth of the United States padded its capitalistic tendency, so it could basically have its cake and eat it too. It had enough money that could have both social programs and capitalism, and nothing went wrong. You could argue that
Right.
Norway or some Scandinavian countries are in a similar position right now.
Right, but even they, you're seeing the rollback of of their social democratic reforms, and they're neoliberalizing as well. Not at the same rate as Canada, UK, and the United States, but it is happening. And you can always you're always going to end up in a situation, I would say, where the contradictions of the welfare state and Fordism or whatever social democracy are going to come to a head, right? If you have the working class and middle class with too much wealth, too much power, rates of profit are going to hurt too much, and you're going to have the capitalist class need to do something about it. And they, in the 70s, what they were able to do was send production elsewhere, to China, to the third world, and that it wasn't maybe a directly thought out plan to hurt the workers in the West, but that was the effect, right? So they undermined the power of labor, and were able to restore profitability by exporting capital. Now we're in a situation where there's nowhere left to export capital to, and in fact, in the third world, they're even at a point where the profitability rates even there are not high enough for the capital of the core countries to reinvest in. So I don't even think it's really possible to. I mean, you could Biden, something might happen, and you could have Biden try to be the next FDR, and it would work for a time, except it would be like 5 years, 10 years until things would really start to hit the fan again. Just with the amount of
I would totally agree, and I think we probably align more than you might have initially thought here. Basically, you're describing an asymptotic approach to like a end of the zero-sum game where we're running out of profits to fuel some form of capitalism, one way or the other. Arguably, you could say that
it's not so much profits.
I was going to say
the rate of profit is getting so low. And
yeah, exactly. That hence inflation, the inflation rates being so low and interest rates being so low, rather. Excuse me. The thing that would flip that on its head, it would be a socialist revolution. That would probably fix it too. But I would argue that the decline of the Soviet Republic was the inverse of this problem. Like a socialist public country being asymptotic to running out of the wealth it needed and maybe the social capital it needed to sustain a socialist country. So I don't necessarily think that a socialist reform fixes that if it creates the same situation where you're asymptotic to a new time where you need to flip the table again.
Well, you probably have heard this before, but you know why Marx always said that the revolution would have to happen in Western Europe and likely Germany first?
Oh, I don't think I've heard this.
So the Bolsheviks were really kind of going against what Marx had said by trying to have a revolution, a socialist revolution, in a backwards, semi-feudal peasant society like Russia. There was capitalism in pockets in some of the cities, not even all the cities. It was just developing. And so there was lots of debates on to whether or not it would make any sense to actually go through and try to push for a worker and peasant controlled society. And so the revolution, because the Tsarist regime was so weak, it worked. They were able to topple them, which is that's pretty good. It's never been done in history. But they were left in a situation where, you don't have the productive capacity of a Germany or in England or even the United States. And the whole reason Marx said that you needed socialism to happen in those countries was because that's where the most advanced capitalist techniques and production had been developed, and therefore you're able to create finally this superabundance needed in order to give everybody what they need on an equal level and abolish classes. Russia was still in a state of backwardness and not enough wealth that they couldn't, for socialism to work, you need to be able to distribute enough resources and things to people, right? Russia did not have that.
That makes sense. And you could argue then, I totally get what you're saying. You could argue that because there was too many basically capitalist entities that were as big or bigger than Russia during their socialist period, it never had a chance to properly form and succeed.
Yeah, well, even Lenin and Trotsky made a point to be okay, we're doing this, but the gamble is that our revolution will inspire the workers of England and Germany in particular, and then when they have their revolution, they'll be like, all right, Russia, we'll help you out, we'll give you some shit. And then the global, because socialism can't work in one country. That's what the fucking Stalinists tried to pass off and pretend was possible. But you could never do it. You're always going to be isolated by the way stronger forces of the imperialist capitalist countries.
I don't know enough about my history at that time to speak to that, but don't you think if any, like you said Russia basically wasn't the right target for it, but don't you think if anyone had a chance during that time period, it would have been someone of Russia's size and economic power? I mean,
Well,
they still got to space before the Americans. They still had a nuclear program. They also had the biggest nuclear disaster, but they still, like, without the influence of capitalism, there were still a lot of successful things happening in a Soviet socialist Russia.
Right, and that's like the goddamn miracle of it all, is that such a backwards semi-feudal peasant society was able to make those leaps in like 30, 40 years time. Like beat the Americans to space. Are you kidding me? Like this is why same story with China, right? Like China is such a powerhouse now. China could never have been the powerhouse they were if their planned production hadn't have laid the groundwork for the capitalism that they're doing now, right? Like if I don't know, Mongolia, for example, had tried the same thing. Like you try to start a capitalist country in a backwards society that doesn't have didn't go through a phase of centralized production. There's no chance. They'll just be a backward country, third world country forever, like a service economy country. But these countries, China and Russia, were able to make those leaps forward because of the admittedly brutal conditions they imposed on their people. That was their only choice, right? In order to build up their economies. That's why Stalinism and even early before that was pretty shitty time for the Russians, and they even had to institute what they call the NEP, the National Economic Policy, which was like allowing a bit of capitalism to go on in like 5-year plans in order to build production up.
But like when you describe all this to me, I don't see the need for a socialist reform. I see the need for recognizing that you can't have both of them. Like I think you and I can both agree without too much debate that a purely capitalist, like a free market thing would be dumb. Like I don't really want to get into that right now because if everything was free market,
that's an important distinction because people, Jack talks about this too. Like libertarians talk about this all the time. They think they think there's such a thing as a pure capitalism that we can get back to, which is of course impossible. They imagine that the state is something separate from the free market and it gets in the way of the free market. No, the state itself is an organ of the bourgeoisie that creates the conditions for capitalist relations to be possible. Like there's a reason states.
Well, it's not just capitalist relations, I would argue.
Give me an example.
Like it's more than just trade being facilitated by the creation of nation states. It's also
that was the main reason.
There's also cultural separation.
If you before,
I mean, I'm
in the like let's say the 1500s, 1400s, the feudal ages, trade was really fucking difficult. If you were a bourgeoisie, if you were a sales guy, if you were selling your wares, like you had real trouble because there were taxes everywhere, in between provinces, in between towns. So what a nation state does is cut out all those tariffs and fees and stuff.
I got to cut you off for a sec because there's a couple points I want to make. First of all, the reason I was saying we both agree with that a pure capitalist society or a libertarian paradise or whatever you want to call it, the reason I wanted to bring that up is I'm trying to say that the same way that I think that's dumb, I don't necessarily think a full socialist reform would be dumb, but I'm assuming it probably would be. I don't know for sure. I don't think any of us know for sure based on some of the points you brought up already. But if I was a betting person, I would bet that the way things go, there would be a bit of a swing of the pendulum back. And the reason I say that it's not only economic boundaries is because states have been around. The concept of a state has been around longer than the concept of like capitalism. I mean, think about ancient Rome had the concept of states, and yeah, they facilitated trade, but that wasn't like they also were boundaries for peace because there were certain tribes you couldn't mess with in Gaul and in Spain and beyond the eastern borders and south of Egypt. People didn't know how to even interact with those peoples, and bound borders were and states were as much about protection as they were about trade.
Well, you can't do trade
So
without peace, right? Like that's why the market goes crazy every time, there's trouble in the Middle East or whatever, right? The whole
sure, but
purpose of
The Gallic people in France before Rome was around didn't have trade borders. They had borders where you don't go fight those people,
yes,
and
but
and you could argue they were states.
the crucial difference though is Greece and Rome, while they had states, their primary mode of production was slavery. It was not capitalism. It wasn't
But I'm talking
markets.
about Gaul. Gaul was modern day France. That was
Sure.
the barbarians at the gate of Rome at one point. They were arguably a state, but they weren't necessarily a state because of trade. The
No,
reason
no,
I
no.
also brought up Rome is the decline of the Roman Republic parallels a lot of what we're talking about as well. I mean, Rome was arguably in many ways a socialist state run by capitalist, ambitious senators. Go ahead.
How is it a socialist state?
I mean, food was given for free. There was labor, like
To
within the
citizens.
boundaries of
To
for
citizens.
citizens. Absolutely, yeah.
Not to the slaves who produced everything.
I didn't say it was an ethical state, but it was socialist.
You could call it maybe a form of welfare state, because it did do distribution.
It
Yeah.
oh, absolutely, but the reason I was bringing it up is it had a conflict of the same ideas we're talking about right now. You know, the uh, tribune of the plebs was often against the Senate, and the various political factions within Rome had a similar debate of whether the state should be serving the people or the people should be serving the state, and whether they should be prioritizing the profit of the few who ran it or the welfare of the many who lived there. And like those same debates have been going on for so long that to me, the historical evidence, like the decline of all the Roman Empire, could be seen as like parallel to the current decline we're seeing in Western civilization, where the first of all, the growing population mixed with a inequality of class creates a tension in the system that isn't solved by adding more money, or in Rome's case, maybe adding more slaves. Eventually, you need to have political reform or a dictator come in, which is what happened for them, obviously.
Yep.
And I feel like you just see the same things over and over. And to suggest that we finally figured out the correct one, everyone else got it wrong before us. They've all been messing it up. No one else has done the thing we did. Like
Oh, no,
Russia
no,
was
no.
so close, but they were too much of I forget what you said, but a peasant state. Like I think that's just as naive as a libertarian point of view in some ways.
Well, okay. The what Marx discovered was that this is all based on, it's materialist. You have to look at historical materialism, right? So it's not that the Romans got it wrong. In fact, they got it basically just right. They just didn't evolve out of that, and they ended up degenerating. And capitalism was a progressive state. Like capitalism is way better in so many ways than what came before, right? Like we don't want to go back to feudalism, although I mean we could have a different conversation. But a rentier based economy might be the direction they're going to end up going. But yeah, so capitalism is a progression, and a state doesn't exist because of markets or whatever. A state exists because to be the organ of the ruling class, and in the Roman times, that meant abolishing the old Gentile system and protecting the slave owning class and citizens who were kind of doing not much at all. If you were a citizen and you didn't have property, there wasn't much to do for you. But in capitalism, the state the modern state arises because we went through about 1,000 years of you could say backsliding culturally and economically. Like in 1,000 years, there was nothing. There was like two things invented, like the mill and like I don't know, one or two, the printing press. I don't know. In the Middle Ages and Dark Ages period. And then the bourgeoisie come along. They overthrow the old aristocracy and the monarchies, and the new nation state becomes for them. Because before that, for the 1,000 years, like there wasn't much of a state at all. Like you could call the Catholic Church and a few kingdoms maybe states, but they weren't really. States now
So if the
are
thesis, but if the thesis is that the states facilitate capitalism through one form
no,
or
no,
the
no. They
other.
facilitate the whatever the ruling class is.
Oh, I see what you're okay, but so that's independent of capitalism in
Yeah,
your
that's
point.
what. Like a worker state that overthrew capitalism would like USSR. You would call a worker state. It wasn't socialist yet. You'd call the same thing for early China, and Cuba. Those are degenerated worker states or deformed worker states. But yeah, they're not like the capitalists don't run those states. Whereas a state that we live in is a bourgeois state.
Okay, but let's say I agree with you on all this. I would still consider this to be a lens to look through things, and not necessarily I agree.
Well,
But
it
let's say
tells us how to
for the
change
sake of
things.
it, I do. Yeah, but I mean, you can use a lot of different lenses like. I wouldn't necessarily assign that viewpoint more credibility until I thought about it more, but I definitely can see the point. Now, if you take that to the is the next step then, and I don't necessarily disagree with this concept based on what you're saying, but is the next step to dissolve the concept of a state in a socialist utopia? I mean, I know that's an extreme. I'm not trying to paint a straw man. I'm just trying to understand better.
No, the what you would do is organize the class whose interests match with that of society as a whole. So for us, that would be the working class, the proletariat. Um, so they would have to take the means of production over and then be able to distribute rationally all the fruits of society. Because right now they're distributed and produced very irrationally. There's lots of waste, tons of waste in capitalism, and of course we get the side effects of global warming, blah blah blah. Anyway, and then once you get to that stage where everyone has a job, everyone has a thing to do, that's not just flipping burgers for McDonald's for $7 an hour, then you reach a point where actually everybody is, instead of being passive to politics and the running of their own society and the producing of their own society, they're actually involved in it. So you get to a point where when everyone's a bureaucrat, no one's a bureaucrat. So eventually the state withers away on its own because it's just not useful anymore, because we've created enough algorithms and robotics to just run society basically for us.
So going back to my game theory example, which was the ice cream vendor salesman, I hear everyone becomes bureaucrats, and I immediately hear what happens to the people who are clever, or think they're clever, and choose to go against the system. How does that system, which you described, where everyone's a bureaucrat, deal with rogue entities, like whether that's gangs forming or monopolies, being created organically? Because that's often what can happen in unregulated socialism or capitalism.
Yeah, well, with everybody, first of all, you need an armed population. So everybody has to be armed, and in order to kind of guard against these things. So, like the American Second Amendment, for example, is something that we're very for because we think it's correct. The same reason the conservatives are correct. The tyranny of the government. Got to fight the state.
Yeah,
And
it's the bottom right corner of the political compass meme agreeing with the bottom left corner.
Yeah, yeah. Well, at least at first, right? Guns are needed until they're not needed, right? Until like once there are no classes.
But
It
the absence of guns creates an advantage of guns, so they can never go away in that example, to me. Like
but
if no one was armed in the future, then
but
all
they
of a
will
sudden
be
the
armed.
first guy who, okay, but you mentioned the need for them going away.
Right.
The absence of them at that point would inherently create, like, those types of weaknesses if you consider them a weakness in the future, would just open up the door to someone who's willing to bring guns back.
Yeah, but bringing guns back doesn't really help you if no one else, like, if there's no incentive to join you and take other people's, like, you have everything you need.
There would be incentive. You could
What would be the
like you see
incentive?
this is where I do think enlightened centrism comes into play, because these concepts of utopia paint pictures. Not I'm not using that word condescendingly, because I do genuinely think something like that, if it worked, is a utopia. But
Marx,
if it,
like,
but
Marx was
I
anti-utopian. He wrote a lot against the utopian
well,
socialists.
okay, but I'm just talking, when I'm saying utopia, I just mean a good world. I don't mean
Okay.
like a literal political definition. Like you're not anti-good world. So um, if in that example, like I just see when everything becomes the same, whether it's capitalist or socialist, you create these imbalances that favor either rogue entities or special groups to basically come in and usurp the power structure. I mean, that's literally what happened in Rome and in Russia and in arguably America during the Confederation of the states, when there was this system in place and it gets so unbalanced one way or the other, and it causes major reform, but that reform never can go all the way. America didn't become land of the totally free with no consequences. There's still taxes that pay for roads and policemen that enforce laws and courts that support a system. It just has ideals of freedom baked in that trick some libertarians into thinking that.
I think you brought up Russia an example and how it degenerated, and I think that's really good because, um, you know, in the situation they were in materially, which we talked about, they and after the First World War and the Civil War, literally 14 imperialist nations attacked Russia and attacked the Bolsheviks like right after their revolution for like 2 years, and they finally beat them off and won. Thankfully, because there was a world war that had exhausted all these imperialist powers. Anyway, after that, basically all of the workers that had um, helped win the revolution, and the ones who had all the technical expertise, they were mostly dead. So all you had left was basically the old bureaucracy from the Tsarist regime. And so, Lenin dies and Stalin takes over, and he's basically like, all right, well, what do? I guess we got to bring these people back. So you end up with, because they were the only ones who had any expertise of how to run society. So they had to bring back this like layer of bureaucracy, who ended up becoming a new caste or layer, you would say, of that class. And that's what you would not have to deal with. Let's say if Canada, next year had a revolution, because the level of, like, people couldn't even read. Like most, like the level of literacy in Russia was like 5%, 10%, right? We could live in a completely different society now. People are now, educated enough to be able to do the tasks of running society without having to rely on some on the former rulers to do it for you.
Okay, well then, okay. To be fair to each other, let's do something. I want to bring up that bingo card and actually go through them, because I don't understand some of the references, and
You,
I want to see if you could explain them, and maybe the ones I agree with, there's something
okay.
interesting to talk about, and maybe the other ones we can agree on something.
Yeah, the bingo
But
card, by the
before we do
way,
that, I
I was mostly for if I ended up bringing right wingers on. Those are mostly right winger talking points. But yes.
That's okay. I still would like to go through it, because I don't understand them all, and I'd like to learn if you're able to bring it up on screen.
Okay. Ooh, let's see
But
if we can do
first, before we do that, I'd just like us to each take a turn to summarize the other's position as best they can while being as polite as they can.
that.
Because I want to hear what you think it is that I'm thinking, and I think the inverse would be helpful to you. From my perspective, what you're saying is that in some way or another, true socialism, in a way that could be effective, has never been achieved in the past. And in addition to that, if we actually did achieve it through a large social and political upheaval, with the correct guides and instruments in place, it would be probably the most productive form of a state, or maybe a state's the wrong word. Maybe it's just a society.
It would be a state at first.
A state at first, but in the long term, I mean, the concept of a state becomes less useful, as you said, and I actually see the merit to that point. So I would concede that at the very least, and I actually don't have anything to. I don't think anyone can prove that wrong because it's never been done before. But I don't necessarily think it's right, but I don't think you could be proven wrong. But from my perspective, that's more or less what you're saying.
Pretty close, yeah, I would say. Maybe an issue of framing, I think, would be my only difference. But I'll go to what I think you're saying is that we can take the best of markets currently, and we can take the best of public services and the government, and combine them to create a system that I guess can, like you were saying, can go through ebbs and flows over time, and I guess they would correct each other. Like some people have this idea that you need to have a liberal government for a few years, and then you need to have a more progressive government like a conservative government, and then a more progressive government to balance each other out. That type of thing, and that this would be a way to keep capitalism stable, I guess, over time, and somehow the whole world, I guess, could do this as well, and we'd end up in a all better for it. Even the current like third world countries.
Improve society. I mean, the same thing on either side of our point. I think that's mostly correct. The only thing I would add is that I also don't necessarily. So as much as I do think it ebbs and flows, I do also think there's sometimes moments in history where large reform is needed. I think we're in one of those moments. I do think we need a upheaval. I just wouldn't say that a socialist upheaval is necessarily the correct way to go forward. But when these things break, I absolutely would agree that they need to be reformed. Or oftentimes they need to be. And those can take a lot of different forms, whether it's the fall of the Roman Republic, or the fall of the Roman Empire, or the fall of British rule in America, the fall of the Soviet Socialist Union, the current I don't know if you'd call it a decline, but certainly a small decline in the power of the West at the moment. And I think all of those examples come to head where they need, at some point, a large reform. Whether or not the solution is socialist is where we disagree.
Okay, well, what if the contradictions of both the Roman and Greek slave societies and capitalist mode of production are such that they can't do anything but eventually abolish themselves? What if that is the reality? And
Isn't that what large scale reform essentially is? Like a self-abolishment, saying this isn't working.
It's a reset. Different. Sure, yeah. It's an attempt to reset.
So
and get things back on track.
I would agree, but I would also argue that you could talk about the subtle flaws of whatever the Soviet version of what they attempted is, but it was still given for all of its flaws, it was still given a honest to God. Honest to God is a funny expression for atheists, but it was still given an honest to God try, and it wasn't the only try, but it was an honest to God try, and I think I would like to go into the bingo card though, because I feel like you and I could go back and forth like a tennis match with those points.
Okay, let's do it. But there is one main point I want to get back to. Let's do it.
Yeah, open it up, and I want to see it on screen while you're doing that. But go ahead.
Okay, let's see if we can add the bingo card. Do you have it on your screen?
I can have it up, but I was hoping we could. Yeah, I just want. I mean, do whatever makes sense, but I can.
Okay,
definitely
I'll find it. I'll find it. Name the first one, and then I'll as I'm finding it here.
So, capitalist labor is not coerced. Is that a common point that centrist or right-wing people make?
That's a libertarian point, yeah. Yeah,
the idea being
actually,
that,
a lot of normies would probably say that too. That you have the choice,
So playing devil's advocate, how is that solved? How is the lack of so is labor coerced in socialism? And even if it's not, how is the implicit problem there solved in a socialist society?
Well, it was definitely coerced in China and Russia. That's for sure. well, and especially under Stalinist Russia. Again, they didn't have the means of production available to not coerce their own population. That's why it was a brutal dystopian shithole, especially under Stalin and Mao too. Mao was a dink. That's why it's like
Right.
some people argue, like Kautsky argued, and a few people argue, even on the left, that it was irresponsible of Lenin and the Bolsheviks to
So in the I don't want to call it a utopia, but what do you want to call a future that was formed by socialists like yourself?
I, it
Socialist
depends what
society,
stage. Yeah, socialism or a classless, stateless society.
a socialist, classless, stateless society. You could almost abbreviate that to something with a
No,
bunch
no,
of
no.
S's.
Those are two different options. You could just say socialist.
I think CSSR works nice, and it sounds like USSR.
CSS.
Classless, socialist, social. Um, well, classes, socialist, stateless republic. That's what you're describing. The CSSR.
There you
TM.
go. There you go.
In your CSSR, how is the problem of labor solved? Is it something you have to be educated enough to understand you need to play a part in, so there's no need to coerce?
Sorry, I just found the bingo card. Say that again.
How is the problem of labor not being coerced solved in your CSSR?
Um, for the simple reason that so you at first, of course, you wouldn't have to coerce. You would incentivize. For example, you would incentivize small farmers to produce, hemp or whatever the fuck, and you would pay them extra to do that. And you would incentivize people, like you would have one national public bank instead of all these other banks. You take them over. You wouldn't wipe out people's current amount of money they had in the bank account, but you would take them over, and then use that money to incentivize the work that needed to be done for society, whether that's cleaning the oceans, building nuclear power plants, whatever the fuck. And that would be the first stage, until you got to the point where society, you could give everybody basically, like the work day would get shortened from 8 hours to 6 hours to 4 hours to 2 hours, to the point where you had all the work would be geared towards having a society where that could run itself more or less, and then people are free to do art, do poetry, do whatever the fuck, play sports, play video games.
But some people, like some production would still have to be done. You still have to eat. You still have to take shelter.
Right, but think about how much of that is automated already. Think about making you can make houses completely out of hempcrete right now.
Okay, but someone still have to build them. Someone still has to grow the food. Someone still has to maintain the robots.
Sure, and that's where you'd work your 2 hours or 4 hours a day.
Okay. I mean, I would argue that's the inverse of a slippery slope, where you've kind of said, like, look, if it's getting better like this, it's going to be better. But I can buy it for the sake of the argument. And then, I mean, incentivization just sounds like capitalism with extra steps. But I'll beleaguer the point. I don't want to beleaguer the
Well,
point.
except there's
'cause I
no
want to get
classes.
through the card.
The big difference is there's no classes, and you democratically decide where
Yeah, but
where production happens.
if there's inherently class though in the guys who are more productive if they get incentivized better. Like if you get more money for doing more, then that'll be a richer farmer.
You're right, but no. But see, that's the difference. People sometimes misunderstand what class means. The class materially means like owners and workers, whereas you could have workers that are
Oh, the removal of capital. Okay, I can buy that. Like
Yeah,
you're
so-
only paid for work.
yeah. You will have workers that make more, that are more productive, and they'll get more benefits for that, right? But no one will go starving, and you won't have anybody working. Capital doesn't get privatized. No one owns their own means of production. That's the main thing.
That's actually a great. I'm sure there must be a bingo card here for innovation or something, because that would be the next point, right?
I think it's in there.
That would be the next point. I would, if I was arguing more intensely, that would be what I'd saying. That competition drives innovation, right there, bottom right quadrant.
There you go. That's the easiest one to
if you lose, then the elimination of capital, but then the natural capitalist response to that, and if everyone just paid for work, is you now lose innovation because no one has any desire to go above and beyond whatever it is their quota can provide, like whatever they can do in 8 hours.
But why
That
would
now,
that ever happen? Humans are still social animals, right? We're still going to have social hierarchies. There's still going to be people are still going to want to be it's just like if you go back to like the 1800s, 1700s, the beginning of science. The aristocrats would be the ones who became scientists, right? And they had nothing, like they didn't work, like they had no there was no uh uh material benefit for becoming, the scientist who figured out some math problem. It was prestige and status among your peers, that would drive you, if anything, or just wanting to solve problems. So in a socialist society,
yeah,
you
and
basically get to
to your
have a
credit,
society where everyone was the aristocrats, could just laze around all
to
day
your
solving
credit,
problems.
plenty of innovation happened in the Soviet Union, an imperfect socialist state. So it's not even
Yeah,
like you need to reach that far back to be proven correct there.
I know. I like to use
You might argue.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm just saying I like to
Okay.
use the
You,
aristocratic example instead.
fair enough. I mean, I think when I think about innovation in capitalism, you oftentimes get innovation only because of profit. Like there's no one who's passionately working on uh, micro optimizations that won't get them that much credit unless they're at a big company. So I definitely, even though I think I can agree with you on a fundamental level of people will innovate for various other reasons. I do think you'll lose a pace of innovation, certainly in certain sectors, if there's no financial incentive. Um,
Uh,
I don't know how to quantify that, but I mean, thinking about like I'm a developer by trade, and the software that programmers make oftentimes doesn't solve a need, like for example, food delivery as a service, or everyone becoming a cab driver. Like those weren't solved out of the goodness of people's hearts. They were solved because micro optimizations and little ways to eke a little bit more money out of the system made it financially incentivized to do so.
how many people spend
So
hours, tens of thousands of hours doing, working on open source projects with friends, making edits of video games that they love,
but all
for no
but that's
profit.
just what you're preaching to me now is a blend. So because even in that concrete example, like if you want to bring up open source software, there's no one better to talk about it with than me, because as much as I love open source software, I will go and find an open source of everything that I can. There's so many underpinnings for the software open source community that are funded via, sometimes privately, sometimes publicly. And there's plenty of, like, even if you run a Linux homebrew system, oftentimes you'll have to specify whether or not you want to use the licensed software, or if you want a clean install without it. And if you choose the one without it, sometimes you're left without a lot of quality of life improvements. The point being, even in the most optimistic socialist, or at least you might call communal efforts, there's still a lot of support from the capitalist underpinnings, or other groups.
Do you know where all the how the iPhone was came together?
Is that I mean, where are you going with this? But I do know the story, most of it.
Okay, well, I mean, then you probably already know that what I'm going to say, in that it's that literally every single piece of technology that was put in the iPhone came out of either directly government funded research, or actually no, it was all innovations that came from, either Russia or government funded research, not profit driven, necessarily research. Like they
But
didn't come from the innovations of some capitalist firm.
okay, but they were assembled by a capitalist firm, and even the other
You don't
story.
think somebody could have figured that out on their
It's
own?
not
If
that. It's not that. It's that even it's funny you bring that example up, because even within Apple, there was a little microcosm of capitalism, because there was actually multiple teams running the same product development at Apple, and they ran internal competitions where the best one was the winner,
yeah,
the
sure.
one they
You
actually produced, the
you don't think
original.
You don't think you could do that? You could have multiple teams doing that in a socialist state?
Well, I
Why
think the
why couldn't you?
funding for it came from the want for the profit of selling a phone to pub. Like, I
If
very much doubt there was people passionately working on scroll animations until a capitalist firm did the research and was like, hey, you know what, this is actually going to turn out to be really profitable if people like this that much better. Like, there was I'm a little bit hesitant to go on in this because I feel like in this conversation I'm normally on your side. I normally say there's a tendency for these things to be socializable, where open source does work. Like, it absolutely does work. I don't want you to be thinking that I'm saying the inverse of that is somehow true, but I do think that society benefits from the blend.
we have
And
enough psychological data to tell us that people will do things. In fact, monetary incentive often makes you less likely to want to do it, right? Like if you're put in a room and someone says, "Here's a puzzle," and then and nothing else, you'll do the puzzle. If someone says, "Here's $5, do the puzzle," you're going to lose interest in the puzzle.
well, yeah, but there's also a certain serotonin patience, right? Where it's like, if people could just treat their work as a puzzle, they would just do it without a problem in that implication. But if there's not a good uh, reward time frame for the input for the effort, they won't do it. So they need to be incentivized outside that framework. I mean, puzzles are a great example because they're fun to do and get done, and you can see the progress. But oftentimes in work, at least certainly in my work, you don't see a benefit or right away. There's a lot of different pieces moving around, and I wouldn't be working on what I was doing unless I was told to, because I didn't want to work on that. I wanted to work on something else.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be people doing, well, not always, but there's going to be people doing menial tasks, and they probably would be shared around. But I mean, the benefit
But
of
but 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 then but then the lower class in your example are those doing the more menial tasks because they're not smart enough, or they don't.
that's why I said they'd be shared around, and
It's funny.
they would also take a couple generations too, because you would finally be able to educate people in a much better way once everybody's cared for, and you don't have so much alienation. And fathers being put in prison for drugs and whatever. Like you'd be able to have a much better Finland style education system globally, that would prepare people to actually do the work of building a better society.
It's you're making a lot of good points. I'm not like, if we were talking at a party and there was someone disagreeing with you, I would probably be taking your side. So it's funny that I feel like I'm in this position where I'm trending towards the center, but I do feel like the examples you are giving to me demonstrate the beauty of a capitalist socialist partnership. And someone like you might find that gross, but like, for real, like, it's like when I think about the combination of, for example, the internet, which probably started as mostly a capitalist exercise funded by public money for the initial investment, but then grown through a private desire to charge people monthly bills.
Well,
I
I would say that the internet is more of a like a publicly funded thing. So I think you would say it was started more socialist, more public, and then was once it was connected to all these universities and installations. Then they were like then they unleashed it on the private market, and then they gave it to the market, and that's the same thing you could say for China. China developed socially all these means of production, and then unleashed it in the 80s with Deng to capital. Let capital take advantage of everything they had built prior, and that's what capitalism does. It takes advantage
but
of the things that the public sphere has already built up for it.
but
They can't do it themselves.
absolutely, but I see the public sphere taking advantage of private innovations as well. And I don't think there's
Sure,
anything wrong with that.
sure, sure.
Like it goes back and forth is kind of the point I'm making. Like, okay, DARPA, arguably military money, public money though, but military money, made the internet, then gets kind of co-opted by research groups and government agencies and then universities, and then someone thinks of the genius idea to start selling it to everyone, and then that kind of hops on the bandwagon of computer science and personal computing, which kind of creates this. By the way, personal computing, another great example of a public-private partnership, probably started mostly public money, I'd fully agree. But the personal computer, the growth of personal computing could be arguably attributed to private interests. Then once those things converge, you now have government, public entities using private infrastructure to serve the needs of their constituents via healthcare websites, Service Ontario, etc. A public-private partnership in the sense that over time, these things kind of go back and forth where they have served each other.
Yeah, there is a feedback in our current system. Yes, I won't disagree there.
And
But I would say
to your point,
go ahead.
I was about to say what the point you're about to make was that might have also been able to be achieved through pure socialism. There's no way to, like, I can't. We don't have an example that's satisfactory to either of us to prove or disprove that. We have theory. We have lots of theory. We have lots of paper talk. But I don't think we have an example where we could say definitively socialism would work. You might believe it does, but I'm skeptical of it.
So it wouldn't. It's not. It's okay. I'll get to the. It's kind of getting to my main point. It's not that it's, 100% sure that a socialist society would be every bit as innovative as the capitalist society. Although I would actually argue that the evidence shows that the public sector, the innovations that have come through the public sector, to completely dwarf anything that comes out of the private sector in terms of its use to society as a whole. Like there's all kinds of like rinky-dinky innovations that capitalism comes up with that really are good for marketing and like not much else, and don't serve a social need. But the point I'm trying to make is that.
But eventually, no, you're right. I know the point you're making. It's that socialism wouldn't necessarily be as effective, but it would be maybe slower, but it would also be fairer and it would serve everyone more equally. And that's, I think,
not the point I was making.
Oh, okay.
The point I was making is that it actually, at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter whether there is slightly more, slightly less, or a lot more, or a lot less in terms of innovation, because capitalism is on its death throes, and it can't, and it's basically ending under its own weight in the next, let's say, 50 years. It doesn't have anywhere to expand anymore. The global rate of profit.
Fair enough.
So the question is what comes next.
I heard capitalist.
The question is what comes next, and social democracy can't solve the contradictions, right? So you have to think of like what do we do?
I think I'm mostly inclined to agree with everything you said, to be honest. Like I generally think capitalism's breaking under its own weight. I generally think something big is needed. I also am probably in support of,
what's an example of reform that you think could extend the shelf life or maybe stabilize capitalism?
I'm not trying to save capitalism. I'm trying to prevent pure socialism the way you and I would both try to prevent pure capitalism. I don't see pure socialism as quite as dangerous as a pure libertarian open market society, but I don't necessarily think that it's an effective approach. People like yourself point to the failures of the USSR as being like for this reason and the other reason, but I don't want to paint a straw man for either of us, but I just don't buy that it's not also going to have its own similar looking problems where it'll fail under its own weight of something else. And I have yet to see proof of that otherwise. We probably need a socialist experiment, but are socialists like yourself not going to be satisfied until it's the right one, until it's the biggest country doing it the most? Or is it like it does, like what's gonna, my guess is in the future, at some point that's going to happen. There's going to be some kind of a socialist experiment, and it's probably going to be good for many reasons. But I also see a weight of something building up. Now, could be corruption, could be waste, could be a lack of innovation, could be bad actors within the system that you just literally can't remove. I just don't buy that it won't have similar problems. And even if you need a revolution to fix things temporarily, I feel like there's nothing that's not going to be temporary, whether it's the capitalism in its current form, a socialist experiment in the future, a Roman Republic back then, a Roman Empire back then. All of it is fleeting. I mean, I feel like the astrophysicists of previous generations had a good idea of that, where anything you try to build is going to be temporary and won't work forever. One question we're getting is, do you guys feel we have a pure capitalism system? No, we don't. I don't think either Eamon or I think that. I mean, I'll let
I
him
do.
speak for
I do
himself,
think we
though.
have that.
You do think we have a pure capitalist system?
Yes. And so this is one of the things I wanted your framing of your framing of pure capitalism and pure socialism is again very I guess I don't know liberal or
Don't you think the
libertarian.
existence of public entities and social programs disprove that to some extent?
Not at
Or
all.
you would argue that they're in a larger capitalist system, therefore they can't be considered, like the larger framework they exist in is capitalist, therefore they're not socialist.
It's the state is a bourgeois state, so everything it does is in the interest of the bourgeoisie. So if the state thinks that it's in its interest for stability and for markets and for profitability to offer free healthcare, to offer childcare, to offer minimum wages, then it will do that. So and in fact, I would argue that you need these things. The capitalist state needs to expand, and especially in the imperialist core countries, it needs to offer its own workers and middle class people more benefits in order to keep the whole thing stable. And because all this extra money is sloshing around in the imperialist states which siphon money from the third world, so and inevitably a more powerful working class is going to rise up and be like, well, we want a cut of this shit, so they're going to do that, which they did in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and so fought for the 8-hour workday and all this fun stuff, and we have all these benefits now because the working class fought for it. And the capitalist class was like, well, shit, if we don't give them this stuff, then they're going to be really pissed and things aren't going to work. So this like what we have now, you couldn't really have capitalism any other way. So like the free market capitalism
I
of
know.
the
I see what you're saying. I don't really have a good response to that because I can see what you're saying, that there is a um, you could make the case that any socialist thing we do now is serving that class. I would,
but it's not so.
but
But I
no,
think
no,
your
but
definition of socialism is
I know the point you're making, but we do have different definitions of socialism. But look at the question that's coming up. Evan's asking, what proof is there that there's nowhere for capitalism to expand, and also if the government bails out people and companies, is that socialist? I the point I think I can answer this actually, which is if that government is serving capital more than it's serving people, then it's just creating social programs to basically quell the masses, is the point I think Eamon is kind of making. And what's the proof that there's nowhere left for capitalism to expand? Well, there's no proof that there is room for it to expand, and there's lots of trends that it's declining. So, I mean, I think you're right to question that there is nowhere for it to expand, but you could also just as equally shine doubt. I'm not sure. You commented before, Eamon, that there was a problem of framing in some of my positions, but I would argue that you could turn that around the same. And
sure.
um, in that the frame, like I could see that if you consider the state to be a bourgeoisie serving state, and that those institutions exist only to basically maintain that status quo of capital being the real power, I could see that allowing you to see those government social programs as not being actually social programs, because they're more just like what's the word, opium for the masses. But I mean, a lot of people on the other side would consider that naive. I see them as a blend.
Yeah.
I don't see it as naive. I really don't see it as naive. I see it as a good point to be made, especially if you have class inequality. But I mean, a social program, like if someone didn't like a socialist utopia in the future, like the one you're describing, I know utopia is the wrong word, then they would see all those social programs as being an opium of the masses for the sorts, where their desire to make industry is being stifled, or their desire to compete. Not that would be taken away, and I can see. I don't want to argue against myself, but I don't necessarily buy that it's not just a framing problem the other way now.
So social reforms are, I mean, it's not only that they're a way to quiet people down and keep things stable. You could have a a workers' party pushing, in power, for example, like there was in Germany in the 1920s, that pushed for workers to actually have more power in society directly. But if they were, for various reasons, uh, co-opted and influenced by the capitalist class, and well, the leaders were, I should say, and so that ended up falling apart, and you got the Nazis. Um, Now I forgot where I
I
was.
want to respond to Evan in the chat real quick because I sense we have new uh, a new contestant in the ring. But he's saying what he's saying is that we have socialism when governments bail out companies. I think I think
That's
that's the
literally
framing
capitalism.
I'm talking about. I think that's uh, I think that's the framing problem I'm kind of talking about, Evan. Where to me at least, where if you see the things we're currently doing as socialists, like the social programs we currently have, or bailouts as like basically both sides of this argument, either pure libertarian, or pure capitalist side, whatever you want to call it, or the socialist side, they would both call what we have not the good, like no true. What's the no true
No
Scotsman
true
version
Scotsman.
of
Yeah.
their ideals? Where when we're bailing out companies and we're saving the poor, that's not true capitalism. Or when we have a capitalist framework that's like it's the same framing problem where someone like uh, me, I'm kind of saying I like the blend, and to me it looks like a blend,
All
and
right.
and
Well,
that's probably where we disagree. I mean,
to simplify, I'll just give the definition, the Marxist definition, or at least part of it, of socialism, and that's worker controlled, not just worker um, run or whatever, worker owned and run and managed production, and no more commodity production, or at least commodity production no longer becomes the dominant form. So all those other things you're talking about, what Bernie Sanders is talking about, what AOC is talking about, what Sweden is doing, those are all still capitalist, because workers don't, like, even when you nationalize things and put them under state control, it's not under worker control, so it's still not socialism. So a state
because
doing a bunch
yes,
of
I'm
things,
actually following you now because the state doesn't serve
yeah.
that doesn't serve correctly at the moment.
Well, I mean, the state serves who it serves, but like when Evan says something like true capitalism would allow small and large, or small companies to, or large companies and small companies to fail, no, capitalism is where you bail out the capitalists because you're a capitalist state. Um, it has nothing to do with promoting small business. And
Yeah,
small
no,
business,
I know what you're saying. I listen, you in your quick summary of the socialist state and the things that would be, it's a worker run thing. My mind immediately goes to the faults that could creep in
sure.
basically I feel like the assumptions that you rely on being possible are some things that I'm very skeptical of being viable. So, like a worker-run state where everyone is kind of doing their fair share, managing things without the need for a state and capital. I like that to me sounds naive. Like nothing could go wrong. And I mentioned a few things
I didn't say
that
nothing can go wrong.
no, I know. I'm sorry, but there's the assumption that that would be viable at scale, and that's where I'm doubtful.
Well,
Where,
it happened in Russia. I mean,
it happened in Russia line is a difficult. Well, there's poison pills in all of our existing examples, right? It's like okay, well, it happened in Russia, but Russia got this wrong. I can't think it was there ever a libertarian state you could point out to me that would help me educate me on the other side of this? Like, is
yeah,
there
a libertarian
did
state
anyone ever
would be
attempt it?
Somalia. No rules.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there's other people that would. I mean, is Panama maybe arguably a libertarian state?
Basic. I mean, libertarians don't believe in the state, so, or they believe in as little state as possible, where you have just like random private adjudicating bodies and private courts to like compete with each other. It's a mess. Libertarians don't make any sense. But
Fair enough. We're approaching like 80 minutes. So I'd like to take a look at this card again real quick.
yes,
And address some things Evan's saying. I don't think government should get involved in private companies. It's the same thing where companies should be allowed to pay less tax. I don't think government should get involved with private companies. I mean, for me, I like if Evan was on the show, I feel like I'd be sounding like Eamon, where I don't feel like you can have that. I feel like when you have capitalism without regulation, it's scarier than socialism for me. But actually, maybe not scarier than pure socialism because we don't know the problems of it because we've never had a pure socialist state. It's the same thing where companies are allowed to pay less tax. Yes. Okay. I can see the point you're making. I'd like to hear Evan's thoughts on this sometime. But let's go to the squares, unless you want to say something about that.
go for the squares. Or actually, no. I'll just answer
Which one's something that you actually hear from people who are serious and not something that's a meme?
Honestly, I've heard the iPhone thing several times in real life. We already went over that one. The state is the problem. That comes from libertarians. Socialism has never worked. We kind of talked about that. Totalitarian, and I could probably.
Oh wow, a few of these are big yikes. Scandinavia is ethnically homogenous. Jesus, I don't.
Oh yeah, that's for like.
I'm big pat on our back for not wading into race on this one.
Yeah, no, that's one you hear a lot too.
Yeah, I mean,
or this one at the
if
bottom.
That played a part in a successful capitalism, then I don't want to be a part of successful capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The state is the problem. I mean, that it sounds like that's one of the things I actually don't agree with, that you agree with too.
Yeah.
The state is the problem.
Yeah. State.
Oh, Sam Chellan, was the 19th century Britain or the US a libertarian state? There was minimal government except government intervention to protect capitalism.
I can answer that. Yeah, early like 1840s, 1830s capitalism was not libertarian, but it was a free market. It was a free market. But the only reason it was a free market was because it was the early stages of capitalism. The only way for capitalism to go from there, no matter what you do, is going to be monopoly, and monopoly is going to evolve, no matter what you do, into finance capital and imperialism. So saying you want to go back to some previous libertarian free market state is just hilarious.
I would also argue that there's plenty of libertarian states that existed before any government existed. I mean,
sure.
When there was no central authority, that was all libertarian. You could do whatever you want. You could, if you thought slavery was ethical, you could have slaves. If you didn't want like slavery, you didn't have to have slaves, and you could be killed by the lack of food that you had because it wasn't being provided by a state or authority. But you could also steal food and do anything. I mean, maybe that's more like anarchy, but
the technical term for those societies would be barbarism.
Well, but there was still trade.
In different stages.
So, and there was still some.
Yeah. There was
still tribalism.
Yep. All part of barbarism.
I'm sure you know this, but you know where the word barbarian comes from, right?
Yeah.
The Greeks were doing impressions of their neighbors, and they sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. So they called them barbarians, which is just my favorite little bit of history. What other of these are real? Let's go through them. Totalitarian. Nah.
I should cut.
That. Bread lines. Bread lines. That's funny. I mean, just start a business. Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, just start a business. I mean, why don't you give away all your wealth and possessions? Oh my goodness. Do people say that to you?
Oh my God. Yeah, I've heard that.
Which of these do you think triggers you most when you hear
it? Gosh, I mean, they're they're all dumb in different ways. Some of them are just like factually wrong that you can just like easily like show them the data or the evidence. Like, I don't know, the 100 million dead one, or the Nazis were socialist. Like, just like read any history book, no historian thinks the Nazis were socialist. Like,
I can see why the top right one is interesting. Socialism is when the government does stuff.
yes, this is
That's
the
one that you and Evan would argue about on,
yes.
right?
Well,
Where because Evan's saying the government doing something is an instance of socialism, and you're saying no, it's not.
no,
It's
that's
serving a
just the
capitalist
government.
or statist framework.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
I think it's
misunderstanding
an
of what
interesting
socialism means.
point. I really liked it. I also think it was really interesting how you asked me to reframe the concept of socialism, because I don't think I could do the same thing for, you could almost argue based on, and I'm arguing in your favor here, argue that the natural progression of things is socialism. If anarchy is more akin to libertarianism, because there's still trade and no one interferes with anything. As people get more educated and a global society starts to develop, socialism seems to be the natural progression of things, which is an interesting concept that I hadn't thought about before. But I'm still a fucking dirty centrist.
Yeah, Evan is saying, what I am saying is that we have socialism when government bail out companies. No, that is not worker control of the means of production. That's just the government being a government, a bourgeois government. So I mean, yeah, it's bad, but that's still very much capitalism.
We have corporatism, not capitalism, right now. Interesting. These are all good bingo cards. I'm glad I didn't wait. And do I sound like any of these to you? I mean, I'm
You
probably a
sort
little
of,
bit of
you
the top
sort
right
of,
square.
yeah, only in that you're kind of how you framed, having a little bit of socialism with a little capitalism, in that like that's almost it's close to the socialism is when government does stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to recontextualize it for people that maybe didn't understand because we were just going through it, but the concept of socialism is when government does stuff. Neyman is fundamentally arguing, from my perspective, that socialism has never been achieved, and therefore, and the government we currently have doesn't do socialist actions because it's serving an existing capitalist statist framework that upholds the status quo. Whereas someone like me would argue that it is an element of socialism in our current government.
I would say it's social democracy, which is still fundamentally like. So some people argue, like probably Sanders and AOC would argue that
Astros,
that
Astros. Sorry, I just love wading into these comments. Astrostatistician in space says it's basically you're socialist and you use technology, so you're a hypocrite. That's
I
pretty funny to me.
I know that's a
I
good meme.
mean,
It's a good meme.
uh, that's a good meme. I'm wondering if he's being ironic because the point we were making before was how much public money has gone into technology.
Yeah, and how
So, I mean, you definitely couldn't argue that it's totally capitalist. It's definitely, I would argue it's been fueled by a a socialist capitalist partnership, but I wouldn't call it technology either socialist or capitalist right now.
technology is greatly progressed and helped along by the development of capitalism and the means of production. But then at a certain point, it runs its course and stops being a progressive force. I would argue that happened about 100 years ago, where capitalism kind of ran its course. A lot has happened since then, but the argument is that had Germany had its succeeded in its revolution in 1919 or 1918, then we would be in a global situation where everything since then
We'd be
we could be 10
attributing the
times ahead.
successes and innovations to socialism.
Yeah, we could be
Like
10
if we
times
were lived
ahead.
in a socialist world, and someone was, yeah. I know what you're saying. To me, the partnership looks beautiful. Like I don't think it's perfect, but it really does. I think about the history of these innovations and the way that we've tried to course correct within what you would argue is a capitalist framework. Uh, Sorry, astrostatic in space. Didn't know you were a woman. But I would argue that the partnership that fueled the growth of technology was public and private, and I think it's nice.
Um, I mean, in theory, like you would sort of have that in socialism too, right? You would still have private people doing private things together. You would get together with your buddies, and maybe ask the government for some funds to go do something, some project, some whatever. And you might get it if the government said it was, that thought it was a good idea. So, I mean, you would still have that. You just wouldn't have private owned means of production. Just like the factories, the things that actually produce the things we need to survive would all be owned in common instead of one person gets them, gets all the profits from them, and then you have classes for
Yeah, I know that, I know what you're saying. I just don't find it like it's hard for us to, like, we're not arguing the same set of facts in some sense, because whereas I see some things as socialist, your argument is that the whole framework has a poison pill in it because it's got a capitalist classist framework. So we're not evaluating whether or not socialism can do anything if we've never seen socialism do anything. Like, I can look at the past and see it as a beautiful socialist capitalist partnership, but if you don't see it that way, if you see it as something otherwise, then we can't agree that something productive came out of the blend. Like, we almost have two fence posts, and this kind of answers Evan's question. Free market is the opposite of socialism, because the people who believe in a free market see everything between themselves and socialism as being incorrect because it's got too much socialism. And people that believe in true socialism, like you'd argue, believe that our current system has the same problem, but in reverse. We never had a true socialist framework to evaluate things. So we can't, these three camps will never agree on anything if the two outside camps that I'm not a part of think that we don't have a system to evaluate the virtues of their systems.
Well, I argue that as soon as you look at history in terms, like, dialectically and how it evolves and changes, then you understand that what free market capitalism is, how it was a phase of capitalist development, and it doesn't make sense to think of it as a thing you can choose in our current context between have a more social society and a free market society. We are limited by our material conditions in where we can go, and I mean, you could try to abolish the state and create a free market system, but that would have disastrous effects immediately. It wouldn't make any sense. And let's say you were able to, I don't know, take away all monopolies and bust all the trusts. The same processes would start all over again, and you would end up with, like, the more successful companies would swallow up the less successful ones. You get monopolies and you get more imperialism. It would just restart, except at a lower profitability. So, yeah.
I know, but I see a similar cycle happening in pure socialism personally. Like, I can't prove it because we've not had socialism in a way that either you and I would be satisfied with describing as such. So it's hard for me to say my instinct is that, but truthfully, I feel like human nature in a system where everyone is supposed to be equal and we've all been educated to
We're not equal.
do our part.
We're not equal.
Oh,
Some will be better than others.
Fair enough. I guess what I'm trying to say is I see a socialist world like you've described as being easily corruptible, or at least certainly susceptible to rogue actors.
The reason it's tough to be corruptible is because everyone has what they need. So it's hard to corrupt a system where everyone's satisfied with what they're getting.
People don't operate on just what they need, though. They operate on what, we didn't go to space because we needed it. I'm astrotastic in space. Once I started studying history and the development of the economy from simpler forms of society, it became abundantly clear where capitalism ends and socialism begins. Do you have something to add on where you thought it started and ended? And I'm interested in that point, actually. I'd love to bring up a political compass subreddit meme. If you could bring that on screen, I'd like to talk about some of those, if you can find a good one.
A meme of what?
Any of them, the political compass memes.
Oh, I actually have a client I have to get to, like, in a couple.
Oh,
minutes.
yeah.
But
we'll save that for next time.
Yeah. Why is Mises dumb and cringe? Yeah. I am calling names because Mises is a joke. Like, in terms of economists and economism. What was the thing that he argued again?
Well, they were saying that Nazism was socialism was
Oh
the
yeah,
main.
yeah. And, like literally, like the main thing the Nazis fought against were socialists. All they did was like crush work like unions. The Jews hating thing came later, and in fact, the anti-Semitism was tied in with their hatred of socialism. Like, fascism is not an inherently anti-Semitic thing. Fascism is an inherent reaction to the left, to socialism. Now that can get tied up in anti-Semitism, but the reason it exists is as a kind of safety valve for the bourgeoisie. They back the fascists because the fascists are going to do the business that they can't do or they're not willing to do. They'll go beat up the workers in gangs and intimidate them, which is what they did in Italy and Germany, and that's what their function is. So I mean, to call the Nazis socialists, like the whole reason they used the term National Socialist was to attract people from the left who were because socialism at the time was a very popular thing. So they cloaked themselves in this worker friendly language.
Well, it sounds like you got to go soon. Probably a good time to tap out because we've been going for 90 minutes, and I'd like to have some dinner. I am going to read what Astrotastic has written and do some reading because I definitely feel like I learned something. I still firmly in the center, I suppose.
You know what?
But I do feel like I
we all learned
understand something more about socialism.
That's good. We all
Yeah, I
learned something today.
genuinely feel like I did not understand it before this conversation, and you definitely showed me what could be. I'm super interested, but yeah, it hasn't changed my mind. I do think that there's a lot of beauty in the system we have now, even if it has a ton of problems.
There's definitely some beauty in the system, and I think it could be better. The way, if anything's going to convince you, it's going to be go read, everybody in chat and Matt, Socialism or Extinction by Ted Rees. And that one explains basically the economic imperative and global warming imperative for a necessity of socialism. And
well, maybe type the name out in the chat because I didn't catch all that. You cut your mic cut out for me, but I think it was fine on YouTube. Anyways, I'm gonna sign off. Thanks. I enjoyed the chat and appreciate you inviting me on.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming out. It was fun. All right. I'm gonna let you go, Matt.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.